And by the way, for this, if anybody wants to ask a question, you can put your hand up. I will also be looking at the chat if you have any chat questions you want to put in to sort of not interrupt my flow. So I'd rather have things in the sort of new world be open and rather than doing it lecture style. But so thank you very much for the talk. My name is Mark Turrell. My background is technology entrepreneur. So I did my PhD work in collective intelligence and crowdsourcing in London. And I created a company in my 20s called Imaginatic. This was doing collective intelligence systems for Pfizer, Allianz, Merck, Boeing, so large companies. And I was fascinated about how do you tap into the brain power of large and small numbers of people to get them to go do stuff. Even though I had a software company, there was a lot of human dynamics and behavioral science built into the system. And so I became very into behavioral science, neuroscience, and pretty much the science of persuasion, the science also of spread, and the science of scaling. The last book that I wrote was called Scaling, Small Smart Moves for Outsized Results. And as we entered this lockdown world, I'd already been doing a lot of work around people's mental models, how they saw the world. And what I found remarkable as this lockdown and recession started hitting is that at, let's say, the world's big super conference, Davos, at the end of January, even though the virus had taken hold, it was spreading and China got closed down on the Thursday, not a single person was talking about pandemics and recessions in January in Davos as it was starting. Not a single person. It's very, very weird. And what I found was that we need to have, given that our world has changed and was changing, we need to see the world differently. We need to think differently. We need to see it differently. And I began to draft what I'm hoping is a new book, and will be a training course maybe, around how can people see the world differently. One of the interesting things is that, I mean, I was waiting for the next recession to have 20% of whatever good jobs being cut, because there were a number of technologies coming out that was going to change employment, the nature of jobs, the nature of works, and potentially the nature of money, whether they be robots, bricklaying robots that could do construction at all weathers and temperatures, whether it would be robot delivery drivers, where there are warehouses in China where they have massive amounts of robotization, so it doesn't matter if people get sick. You had the beginnings of AI doing art. You have the AI newsreader. I've been fascinated. I have two sons that are both teenagers, and I'm fascinated that my youngest spends about an hour a day at the moment looking at InspiroBot, which is an AI sort of humor inspirational generator. So there's an AI behind the content that he's looking at, and it's sort of no human touch, and he just finds it hysterically funny. We though look at robotization, AI, robo-trading. So these were going to be things in society coming up anyway that would force us to think about the nature of work, the nature of society. But then we look at COVID and the implications of closing down societies, and you find out that any changes in society that were coming will be vastly magnified and their impacts accelerated, whether it be how people shop, how people eat, how people socialize, how people work. These are fundamental and dramatic changes to our society. The problem that we have, though, is that very few people see these things coming, and therefore very few people deeply understand or can even get their heads around what is likely to happen next. And I'll ask this to everybody in the group now. When did you think that Donald Trump would be president of the United States? This is a fundamentally important question. When did people think that Trump would be president? Anybody want to share?
A month before the election. Hi, Mark.
A month before, okay.
I had friends working for Cambridge Analytica at that time. That helps.
Okay,
and
yep.
That was one vote. And then another 3 people told me that I have been doing the analysis, and it looked like it was pretty clear cut. So my crystal ball came from having a network of people with bigger crystal balls and knowing that theirs were bigger than mine.
Okay. Anybody else want to share when they thought Trump came in? Oh, Trump would be president? Yep.
I didn't necessarily think that he would be president or know that he would be president, but I would definitely remember crying with stress before the election. I knew it was a strong possibility.
I can very.
That's just because I have a real diverse friend set, and when you're American and you have a more diverse friend set, you become aware of certain things in like the currents and stuff, so you can sense things a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I won't go around the whole room, but so I gave him an 85% chance of winning as soon as he nominated himself a year and a half before the election. And I have a certain mental model behind that. My logic was driven, the driving logic, and because this goes into, there's a whole toolkit around how do you see the world differently. There's a driving logic, which was that it's very rare for the same party to win 3 times in America. I've lived in the US for quite a long time. So it's very rare for the same party to win 3 times. So I gave any Republican a 90% plus chance of winning. And as soon as Trump came down and he said that all Mexicans are rapists, let's build a wall, I realized how clever he was, like street clever. Because in America, politics is very expensive because you need to buy airtime. And that's why it's so expensive. Trump realized that you can get free airtime by saying wackadoodle crazy shit. And that's what he did. And so he got, effectively, it was calculated as about $2 billion of free press in the first year. In addition to that, the way that American politics works is that it takes, once you nominate yourself as being president, you spend about 6 months hiding away to lobby and get money. But that meant that he was the only person out there, sort of not even on the streets, but just sort of out there in the press. And everybody was making fun of him, but it was a very clever name recognition strategy. So the reason why I'm saying this is that, I mean, I've gone to Davos now for 12 years, and every single year they've missed every single material thing. In 2008, they missed the financial crisis that those people in the room were creating. They missed the Arab Spring while it was taking place. They missed Brexit. They missed Trump. They've missed everything. They missed Corona as it was there. So what I found very fascinating by this, and I actually wrote a paper that I'm happy to share that I call the Davos Consensus, was that people have a mental model of the world. They see that they have patterns that they believe are important and patterns that they think are irrelevant, and they use their mental models to determine what they think is happening. It turns out, though, people don't really realize they have a mental model, and very few people have done the work to understand how their model works, and in particular, when something happens, a shock happens like a Trump or a COVID, they should be questioning that their mental model is broken or they've missed out material pieces. However, because people don't know they have a model in the first place, they therefore never get around to trying to fix it. So what I've been looking at is how can we actually then see the world differently? And fundamentally, I think we need a new lens to see the world and how people behave and how people interact. Now, it's interesting in writing a book on this, going back through time to see, well, okay, have there been moments in our human history where people have literally seen it differently? Anybody know what this is? Take a guess. Galileo's telescope. So the history of the telescope is fascinating. There was a German living in the Netherlands who put 2 lenses together in 1608, and he came up with the first telescope. This got written up, and within 1 year it had spread around Europe. There was no patent granted for it. He did get some money to produce 100 units. This then got to Galileo's hands. Now, he was already a late 30s professor, quite successful at making physical devices because he needed to earn money, because he was the eldest child of a 7-child family. So he had to pay for his sister's wedding, and he had to pay for his itinerant brother's music career. But he was used to making things. And within 24 hours after seeing about the telescope, he'd already made a telescope. And these drawings that we can see here, these are the drawings of the first human being to watch moons going around another planet. Very literally see differently. Now, with the power to see differently in his case, he was very connected to the merchants of Venice, sort of the original types. And that meant that if you were able to see the ships coming in 2.5 hours before anybody else, you could trade ahead of the curve. So there were lots of things this sort of specific invention gave humankind as individuals, as groups, and as organizations, different ways of seeing things. And I can see that we can have this with looking at our society now. When we look at, let's say, seeing from the world of the big, which is very much the telescope, we have the world of the small. Does anyone know where these things come from? So this is from a Dutch scientist called Anton van Leeuwenhoek. Now, he was a textile manufacturer, but he managed to work out how to make very, very high quality microscopes. The microscope had just been invented before by a guy called Robert Hooke in the United Kingdom. But then Leeuwenhoek had managed to take the same principles, and what Leeuwenhoek had done was that he was able to create 100x magnifications, and even as high, people think of 300x magnifications. He was able to see blood cells, which nobody could see beforehand. Well, when he started to publish his work on microbiology, and these are some of his drawings, the scientific establishment thought he was crazy. They thought he was making things up. He saw things that nobody could see. I see germs in water. What was fascinating, though, is that if you have a microscope, microbiology is quite feasible. If you don't have a microscope, you just haven't got a clue what the hell is going on. Now, what is also interesting, if we look at these sort of new lenses, is that whereas the telescope was not patented and was able to spread very quickly, the key technology that Leeuwenhoek had developed, he kept a secret. So his units were destroyed and he died with his technology. In fact, he even pretended that his technology was based on grass scrubbing of glass. Sand scrubbing to sort of get very, very highly polished glass, whereas in fact it was actually tiny, tiny bubbles that got extracted, and it was the tiny bubbles that did it. But what it meant was that even if he was the first person to see bacteria, nobody else saw bacteria for 100 years. So even this new lens technology doesn't have to automatically propagate around the world. Because as we get into this sort of new ways of thinking, one of the things about this new world is that we've tempted to see the world in a very linear way. A, B, C, one thing follows another. However, what is very clear, and we don't have time to get into this thing, but we live in a non-linear world where something happens, but that might be sort of the butterfly wings that starts a tornado or a stock market crash, or it might do nothing. And what we begin to see is that, particularly when we look at the world differently, that there are behaviors that give us much more powerful insight into how people operate than, let's say, pure individualism. So maybe the best example of this, I don't have too much time, but we will get into questions. Would anybody like to know the secret to the whole world? That's good for donkeys. Donkeys are the secret to the whole universe. Now, at this point, you might be somewhat confused. That's fair enough. But what's interesting with donkeys is that in behavioral science, we're taught about the, let's say, in the individual, the power of the individual, and we're taught about the carrot and the stick. Individuals do things because they have a promise of reward or the threat of a punishment. But what's fascinating, if you take actual donkeys, and I've done this experiment before in a farm where there's wild horses and donkeys, I'm throwing out carrots with my son, and we're looking to see, well, okay, do the donkeys come when we throw the carrots out? It turns out the donkeys don't speak English or German, and they don't see very well. So they literally can't see what it is for something being thrown 100 meters away. What's fascinating, though, is that of the 10 donkeys in the field, 3 of them hear something. They notice a movement and their ears prick up. However, one donkey, this is important, she is the curious donkey. She is the deviant donkey. She will deviate from the normal pattern. So not like an ex-person, but just she's deviating from the normal pattern. And she goes to go look. And why does she look? Because she's curious. She doesn't know what it is. Now, maybe she's always the curious donkey. Maybe she's always the first person to do something. Maybe she just happened to be closer. But what's now fascinating is I have a very special dynamic. This is, let's say, a system dynamics of understanding this new world. You have the first donkey goes, and there's 9 donkeys that are still sitting there chewing away grass in the field. What's interesting is that the next 4 donkeys think, well, where are you going? Now, they don't know if it's a carrot and a stick. Maybe, though, she always finds interesting things. Maybe they're just a little bit bored. Worst that happens, we eat grass over there. To be honest, though, what's fascinating is that quite often in these sort of understanding of systems, it doesn't matter. In a positive pickup, those 4 donkeys follow, and now we have 5 donkeys going off. And remember, none of them know if it's a carrot and a stick, and only one of them saw something. The next 5 donkeys, well, I mean, they're all standing there, and they think, well, half of the donkeys have left, we should probably go too. But then typically there's one donkey, now maybe he's been facing the other direction, so he's a negative deviant. Maybe he was the first donkey to arrive there in the morning, but right now he looks up and he's all alone, or I should go follow them too. This is critically important, and we can see this particularly happening now in the world of Corona, because whilst we might have been living our lives as individuals, we are fundamentally a collective species. And in understanding collective species, we've almost been misled about how individualistic people are. And in fact, what we find in this nonlinear world, this social and communal world, that we follow. Humans follow, and they follow anything. And you have a special property of the deviants in these worlds, and we don't have time to get into that, but there's some special dynamics of those sort of first people to do different things, and then the majority of people follow. And just to understand this very well, people follow themselves, which is why there's this notion that people change when there's a compelling reason to change, or people only change, people are afraid of change. It actually isn't so. It takes less energy to keep doing what you're doing. Well, as we live in a post-corona world, people won't be able to keep doing what they're doing. They won't be able to just hop to the restaurant, hop on public transport without thinking, jump on an airplane, all of these things that we were used to, because these things just won't be possible. And it takes a lot of time for people to get their heads around it. So I'll just finish up by saying, so this new lens that I'm working at is going to be a framework. So it's a way of seeing the world. It'll be a set of techniques and practices, and all of these things can be learned. None of this stuff is magic. And I've got these 5 layers of it. What's interesting is that I start off from yourself, because one notion is that sort of you see the world through your own eyes. But then it's a case of once you start looking, what do you see? Then when you see things, what are the patterns and how do you interpret? And where it gets interesting is how do you predict what's going to happen next? And how do you change the future? And so I believe that the new world will belong to those people that see differently and have a new lens. And just as a final thought before we go into questions, I would love to be optimistic about this world that we're coming into now, but I will only be optimistic when individuals get involved in the political process and manage to get voted into office. Unfortunately, right now, there are tremendous opportunities now with, let's say, the largesse of governments to borrow money and give them out to various companies to put in place things around climate, around not doing pollution. And at the moment, we are consistently failing to do that, failing in a bad way. Right now, I'm hopeful given that, let's say, protest movements going out, which are very, very important. But if we look at, let's say, trying to make a new world a better world right now, it means involvement in the political process. And at the moment, we humans, we're losing the battle. However, that does not mean to say that we can't win and can't do interesting things, but it just, let's say, I'm more pessimistic than optimistic, but I think getting involved in the process will be important, but we do need to see differently. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and what questions do people have? And I don't know, do I need to unmute people? I don't know how things work. Participants.
No, you can unmute yourselves.
Okay, good.
I was just wondering, your 5 things went by so fast. Where can I find those?
So I will just, what I will do is, I will exit, click to exit. I'll just share it. I'll share these things with you right now. Copy link, and I'll just share them in Zoom.
You can get the recorded session from the website. I think on YouTube, the unit conferences will be posting most of those conferences.
And then I also have a more in-depth version of the talk that I put together, and then I'm sharing that also in the link right now. That's more like a 70-page deck. So I'm using actually Google Slides to structure my book content, to work out how the flow works.
Sorry, Google what?
I'm actually using Google Slides to help structure my book content.
Ah, oh, interesting.
Because there's a story that goes to it. Otherwise, I've got like 200 pages of research content and it's just all flopping around the place.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to be organized.
Mm-hmm.
The question, I mean, do people agree the fundamental premise that we need a new way of seeing things? Stop.
Indeed, our team here is struggling with how to tell the story of how it's our suspicion, it's our strong belief that humanity needs to up the if you would, the semantic level of how it is that we commune on the web.
Well, and one of the fascinating, I mean, it's with unit, I mean, there is this sort of understanding that we need to do something differently. The deeper work that I've done now is that unless you get into government, unless you basically, unless you write laws and policies, you're all screwed. You can do nice medium posts, you can have a t-shirt, you can have a baseball cap, you can have your best buddies 2 meters away from you having a really nice dinner with them. But unless you actually write laws, you're all screwed.
Do you remember what Buckminster Fuller said?
Where's the toilet? No, I'm sure he said that as well, but.
Well, his notion was that instead of, what was it? I think he attacked this in multiple ways. One way was, yeah, don't strive for revolution, rather change the technologies that are available to people, and basically make it easy for them to follow a new path.
Well, the challenge that we have is that, so I did another talk recently where I got a lot of stick for it. I was saying that pretty much humanity has now become lazy thinkers. And example of lazy thinking would be Instagram stories and TikTok. Not all. So I don't want to, because right now tech companies, and I know many of them, pretty much they have been working for some years to make their products addictive. But making people addictive doesn't mean to say go out into the forest and smell the flowers and look at the trees. Making you addicted says you sort of stare at your screen like this and then eventually click to buy something.
Right.
And many of these platforms that have been created are specifically designed to make people addicted. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is that they will become, and you can see this, that they will most likely disconnect from political discourse. Which means this is just the sheep masses who can't even be bothered to vote. Yeah, so this is one of the problems about just relying on technology to magically making it work. Unfortunately, because of the driving logic of wanting to make money out of advertising, the tech companies are making people more and more mindless.
Right. Yeah. No, I would totally agree that that we're being encouraged, led by our laziness and easy bemusability. In the direction of, Kahneman's, what is it? System 1 thinking. God, I hate that terminology, versus his system 2 thinking.
Which is, I mean, you have intelligent things that have to be dumbed down to fit into a 200-page book, and people can only handle 2 things, System 1 and System 2. There might be 10 systems, but crikey. Yes, yeah, Lauren.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you know of or have developed any metrics for measuring spread or
Looking at spread of ideas or behavior change, or
yeah.
so I've done a lot more work around how do you design programs that can spread.
Okay.
So, and this would be so one of the things to look at
I was
is
just wondering because I've never found like a good metric. I haven't found anyone working on this. So
it's the one of the projects that I worked on is called the Global Teacher Prize, and it's a $1 million prize for the world's best teacher. Now, the subtext behind it is how do we improve teaching and increase the credibility of teachers and teaching as a profession? But then there's a game of souls involved. If there's whatever, 50 million teachers, how many teachers are aware of the prize? If there's 180 countries and various ministries of education, how many ministries are aware of that these things exist? You begin to see it's, let's say, quite easy when you look at something that didn't exist before and now it exists. You can begin to at least track some basic metrics or basic measurements just to see, well, how popular is it? Google search terms. Nobody searched for the Global Teacher Prize the year before it existed, and now there's whatever, some tens of thousands that do it. You can look at the spread within the system. So there's one of the spread metrics would be, if now there's 40,000 people nominating and submitting themselves as teachers, and in the first year there was only 5,000, well, clearly that's spread. You can quite often get media reports then. So they had Trevor Noah, I think, doing the sort of headline, pushing this thing out. And then you can just count how many times did it get seen, how many views did the stories get. And that can look at spreading the message. Now, going beyond that, it'll be how do you spread the practices? So now you could imagine coming up with a manual of here's a great teacher. You can look at how many times was it downloaded, how many countries have adopted it into their mechanism. So you can get into spread. The thing is that quite quickly you go from, let's say, having general advice on how to track things spreading and very specific project-based or initiative-based measures to work out specifically how it works. And then your final problem is that if people are incentivized based on spread metrics, eventually, if the incentives are large enough, people cheat. And what that then means is you can't trust the metrics. So just like in the United Kingdom, they've had the metrics of how many tests are done. And then it turns out they were beginning to count 3 tests per person. So everybody forgot. They just thought that it was a 1-for-1 and it wasn't. So watch out for people cheating. I guess we have 1 more minute left. Is the next person in the room as well? Okay, that's good.
Yep.
I guess we have time for one more question.
Do you speak German?
Ich kann auch Deutsch, ja. Je parle aussi français. Let's see. I live in Germany, but it's actually, I mean, just maybe a final thought is that as I've gone through myself, I realized looking at my new lens and this new world, that I have to reinvent myself. I used to get most of my money out of doing paid talks around the world. So it's like paid holiday and paid speaking at conferences where people would gather. Well, I know there will likely not be this type of conference for maybe 12 months, maybe 2 years. Therefore, that revenue stream for me has totally disappeared. That lifestyle has totally disappeared. I used to be in a different country every week. That's ended. Because there's always a risk that even if I do, let's say, take a trip to somewhere, for all I know, I'm going to be locked in quarantine 14 days there and 14 days back, and I lose months of my life. So it's very, very interesting then looking at how it's worthwhile for yourselves taking a personal look at how these changes in society are going to affect you and the people around you. And then not operating so much on hope, but at least, let's say, sort of doing contingency planning, what might happen, and then how do you manage it? So just some final thoughts. This is me. .com. And my Telegram is the best way of getting hold of me. And this is me. And I've created something called Undavos. And if you'd like to join Undavos, welcome just to ping me. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for your lovely questions. And I wish you all a fabulous day. Thank you.